Turkey has this kind of strategic autonomy. One of the outcomes of the military purges in 2016 is that there's been a shift. Previously in the Turkish military, you had kind of Eurasianist-orientated officers and Atlanticist-orientated officers. Now, many of those Atlanticist-orientated officers are driving taxis in Washington, D.C. because they can't go back to Turkey. So there's, Turkey has moved towards the Shanghai group. There's Turkey in the BRICS and things like that. But Turkey's leveraging this position to give itself a kind of strategic autonomy.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello and welcome to the Bungacast group chat. Whether you were invited or not, this is the Global Politics podcast at the end of history. We don't trade in esoteric knowledge here, so we want full transparency, much like the Trump administration. Our war plans are pretty much out in the open. We want everybody on board with the project, which means understanding what the end of history really means, grasping our moment in its historical specificity, and understanding the political task as being the creation of the conditions for politics itself. So it's late March 2025. I'm Alex Hochuli, and I am joined, as usual, by Bunga George Hoare.
I think I'm probably one of the admins in the group chat, to extend the analogy.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get that privilege revoked.
Are you moderating as well? Because I feel like you would be... No?
No. Just an admin, just adding other people in who don't want to be a part of it.
Yeah, just alphabetically going through your contacts list and Djene Bajalan joining us from Springfield, Missouri, one of the many great Springfields in the United States.
The largest Springfield in the United States.
Is it the largest? I guess that's something.
Supersized Springfield.
Although, given that Springfield has stood for averageness, certainly in The Simpsons, then you'd want to be the average size Springfield. You'd really want to be at the medium. You don't want to be kind of at the edge of the middle. That's weird, right?
Yeah, I suppose it kind of ruins the brand recognition, being the largest Springfield. They're always trying to sell me on this place, saying it's a really great place to live. I was like, yeah, I've lived here for 9 years. Still, the jury's still out.
Djene is also a scholar of the Kurdish question, nationalism, Turkey, which is specifically what we'll be talking about in just a second, amongst many other things. So what are we going to be doing today, this final episode of the month? I'm going to go through a couple of the touch points of the past month, which I think confirm that we're living through a major geoeconomic and geostrategic transition, which makes doing these sorts of episodes that much easier. So at least there's that. We'll also be talking about Turkey specifically, which I think is one of those countries that exemplifies quite well the contradictions of the end of history. So Djene's going to fill us in on what's going on there with the protests against Erdogan, a man who I think whatever happens in the next weeks and months and even years, I think you can claim is one of the winners of the past decade or two for sure.
Yeah, he's Erdogan to watch, you could say.
Oh, he's already Erdogan.
Yeah. He's Erdogan.
Yeah. We got anything? Last time we did an episode on Erdogan, I think it was maybe a year or two ago, people criticized me for doing a kind of show episode cover, which looked like an Economist cover. And I looked back on it today and I was like, crap, that really does. It's red as well. So it looks like an Economist cover and I felt embarrassed.
Well, Erdogan is a man for many seasons. You can imagine him in that political compass meme that they have, where there's like the left-wing authoritarian version, the left-wing libertarian version, the right-wing authoritarian and the right-wing libertarian. He's done it all. He's been everything over the last years. And people like to dog on him, but he's definitely a world historic figure in many ways, like a really significant political figure, I would say, compared to even Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Republic of Turkey. He's ruled longer, and he, as you said at the beginning, he is one of the big winners of like both personally, but also like his vision of the world is kind of the vision of the world that we're seeing coming into being. And Turkey. And I wrote this in 2017 that, like Erdogan was a model for what's happening in the United States as well. Now everybody's catching up on the train. I'm just like proud of myself to be having Paul Atreides like oracular abilities. Well, anyone who followed Turkish politics was aware of the parallels between what was happening in America and what was happening in Turkey, although there's obviously big differences.
So just for listeners who don't get that reference, Paul Atreides is he's from Dune, and he just takes a load of space cocaine and then becomes the Messiah. That would be
space cocaine, and then you can see the historical dialectic because you're so smashed off your face.
Well, I mean, I guess being kind of the world spirit is basically riding the worm, right? So
he is riding the worm. Erdogan is the sleeper who has awoken. He's riding that worm all the way to wherever the hell he's going.
Well, we'll find out maybe where he's going in just a bit. And then we'll finish off this episode with letters to the editor. We take your questions and comments. I guess public listeners, free, non-paywalled listeners will get some part of this. And then the rest of it will be only at patreon.com/Bungacast. So join us there if you want the continuation of this. So the past month, I mean, I think, first of all, we should probably start with Trump's neo-mercantilism. And it's something which we'll explore on this podcast in more depth in other episodes. We're not going to do that here, but I think it's just worth noting that I think some of the tariffs that have been introduced are obviously negotiating ploys at some level, but on the whole, it amounts to a rearrangement of the global economic order. And I think the question is, we just don't know to what degree it is yet. The US is buying up a bunch of gold. Gold just hit historic price level of $3,000 per ounce. And there's even talk in various corners about the end of the dollar. Okay, this has been happening for a long time. There was the rise of the BRICS, et cetera, et cetera. And it's kind of a recurring discussion, but it seems to have more weight to it now. That's not a pun on the weight in the gold or anything. No puns here. We've actually never done a pun on this podcast. But anyway, some even speculate that Trump's ambition might be a return to the gold standard and an end to the dollar's exorbitant privilege, as it's called. You might want to check out, if you want some background on this, episode 139, Dollar Empire, where we talked about what that exorbitant privilege actually is, who wants the US dollar as a reserve currency and who doesn't. And I think the kind of class politics and the geopolitics behind that are really fascinating. So that's a good episode to kind of go back to.
Yeah, I did actually look at how much it would cost for an ounce of gold. You're not seeing people doing these kind of trades out on the beaches of East Yorkshire, but it's over $3,000 an ounce for what Keynes called a barbarous relic. So that's quite expensive. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else you can spend your $3,000 on, but yeah, an ounce of gold. There you go.
Anecdotally, I can tell you that here in the United States, advertisements for gold purchasing firms, the kind of things that they'll have on the talk radio, have them on YouTube, have them even, when you listen to, I mean, I listen to some of the like MSNBC, Fox and things like that on my radio, and you'll hear those adverts, and like this, they're always out there, but it just feels like, one of those moments where like every other ad is like, have you tried purchasing gold, where things like that. So it seems like a lot of the gold trading companies in the United States are really trying to pull people into putting their retirements in gold, especially as the stock exchange is collapsing. People in the United States are often relying on these 401ks. There's a lot of panic around how these 401ks are working. I mean, if your 401k, like I'm 43, if it goes down at the moment, I don't need to freak out too much because I have 30 years left or 50 years left. I don't know when I'll be allowed to retire, but you have time to recover. But if you're like 63 and you're planning to retire in 2 years and your 401k has been devastated, I can see. So it seems like there's a lot of people trying to capitalize on this gold bug stuff here in America. Purely anecdotal. It's just something.
No, but that's useful. Yeah.
Well, you heard it here first. Like, get your savings, put it in gold, keep it in your mouth. Put it in your teeth.
They're aiming at retirees. It's all being advertised to. Like it's a safer investment than your 401k. How do you transfer your 401k into gold?
Well, I mean, if that's a peak, we just advise people to buy the peak, and we'll look terrible. We'll never be able to credibly give investment advice again. So we should end this bit right here, and turn to strategic terms, which I think is maybe more firm ground for us. Though I guess we won't have much to analyze if the Trump administration keeps inviting the press to its group chats. Can just there's no need to kind of decipher what's going on. No kind of criminology needed to be done. Just it's all transparent and out there. But I wanted to just comment on the ceasefire deals, both in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, which seem to kind of point in opposing directions. I don't know what your guys' take on this, so please jump in as I go through this briefly. But over Ukraine, it seems like the Europeans are outraged, accusing Trump of acceding to Putin's every demand. And I think whatever we might think of both Trump's negotiating tactics, what his ambitions are with regard to Ukraine, I think we can obviously we're all agreed that a peace deal is necessary, and that kind of throwing resources and men into the meat grinder any longer is absurd and should be ended immediately, and should have already been ended years ago. At any rate, I think this moment has again exposed the Europeans as being behind the game. So both EU countries and Ukraine are kind of left pleading to their erstwhile patron for continued engagement and funding, and citing the idea that the US has broken a deal which they had given to both the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. And obviously, like in a wider context, American perfidy is obviously an issue, and a continuing one for decades. And could probably just ask the Kurds what they think about that.
Well, it's nice to see someone else getting the Kurd treatment out there.
Right.
Seems a bit fair. They're doing it to a white race, although Kurds are a white race, but under American law. But I mean, this is just a general, it's a general problem with foreign policy, isn't it? Like people get abandoned all the time and it becomes a moral issue. I don't know. I agree with your statement at the top. Like, I can understand why liberals are so upset about this. There's something very icky about they believe in national self-determination. Ukraine was invaded. It seems to hit all the points there. But at some point you just don't have the military and economic resources to reverse that. It's the limits of imperial power. One of my friends who we podcast with occasionally, Kuba Revnevsky, who's worked inside the deep state, he says, you talk to people there and they think that there's an infinite ability of the United States and the West to remake the world. But, here in Ukraine, you bump up against the kind of hard limit of that imperial power. You could technically nuke everybody, but then we're all over. But we're at that kind of hard limit of power. So I can understand the liberals feeling icky about this. But at the same time, it's there's no path to victory for Ukraine. They've already done quite well into staving off Russia. And you can look at the statistics on this. The military threat Russia poses to Europe has been completely exposed as being nonsense, right? Yeah. If they had to face a real army, like even just Poland, they'd probably have to have a very difficult time. Not only that, if you look at the statistics for weapons sales around the world, this war has been disastrous for Russia's ability to sell its weapon systems around the world, because they were coasting off a reputation from 30 years ago to producing good weapons. And now if you're a country who used to do have mixed platforms, sometimes buy some Russian weapons, some French, some Americans, you'll be like, those Russian weapons don't look very good. They don't look like they're actually working on. And you could see a lot of countries that had that kind of mix of weapon systems are not buying Russian weapon systems anymore. So Russia has been completely exposed as a paper tiger. Yes, they'll probably beat Ukraine, but they have far more resources and manpower to throw at that problem. And they have nukes, which gives them that kind of that creates that hard limit on Western imperial power.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly embarrassing for the Europeans, more so than for American liberals, because American liberals, I mean, could still argue that the US should throw its full weight behind it. I mean, of course, that leads to potential nuclear escalation and so on. So we don't want to kind of go down that road. But for the Europeans, it really is like they have got high on the US's supply for quite a long time, and I think this moment has exposed them as being particularly ideologically blinded in a way that more so even than the United States, because they've been relying on this kind of idea of daddy's always going to be there to bail us out. And although the US still probably retains the capacity to do it to a certain degree, there's certainly not the political will there, and the costs of it are enormous. So I think, this is just another moment of kind of European leaders being completely exposed, and it actually makes Emmanuel Macron look like the only kind of sane guy there who had some notion of history, of geopolitics, although politically ineffective in actually maybe even pursuing that kind of more geopolitical role for Europe. And in any case, that's not a horse that we're backing. At the same time, you have, I think, over Israel and Palestine, that Trump has ended up exposing, and here I think kind of in slightly the opposite direction to what's been going on with Ukraine, exposing both the Democrats' unwillingness to say no to Netanyahu and Netanyahu's own slipperiness over the ceasefire deal, of exposing him as being the one breaking it, that in fact that Hamas could be negotiated with, and that all it was needed was a bit more pressure on the Israelis, which the Democrats weren't willing to do. But then on the other hand, it's a complicated scenario, because the leaked messages from the boys group chat, the Trump boys group chat, shows that they wanted to shut down the Houthis in Yemen, to continue aggression against the Houthis, which I think in my mind demonstrates as much continuity in kind of US global policing as it does a sort of disjuncture. So there's things pointing in very opposite directions. And it seems like there was a more obvious solution to this, which was simply like lean on the Israelis a bit harder to respect the ceasefire deal. The Houthis then wouldn't launch their retaliatory attacks in solidarity with the Palestinians, and you resolve both issues at once, rather than what we have now, where the Israelis continue to break the ceasefire and the Houthis retaliate. And then, so it looks more like kind of still much more like the status quo, except that the US demands a bit more payment for its services from the Europeans, and that's about it.
It seems to me here, from the vantage point of the United States, there is a brewing conflict on the political right over this Israel policy, between the kind of pro-Trump neocons who try to, accommodate neocon foreign policy with working for the Trump administration, and the America First things. We got a taste of this kind of with J.D. Vance's contribution to the group chat, where he said he doesn't want to bail out the Europeans. But of course, the other people he mentions, Egypt specifically, but doesn't mention Israel, which seems to be very telling omission, because you could say perhaps Egypt, Israel, and the Europeans need to pay for this, but why leave Israel out? Because of course this blockade is entirely related to the conflict that is taking place in Israel Palestine. And what I'm noticing, at least, not just like random trolls, but people in the commentariat, you see this with a bit of Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens type people, Saga and Jetty. These are kind of big conservative talkers in the United States who have big audiences and who probably reflect some of the feelings that exist within the kind of MAGA coalition. And I get a sense there's a faction within the MAGA coalition who are like, look, we don't care about Palestinians. Like, screw those people. They're savages. It doesn't matter to us. But why are we being so subservient to Israel? People who took the America First stuff very seriously. And you have this example of this, one of the foreign policy team, Bowles, who made this statement, the US is not Israel's agent. Guy disappeared, right? Like removed from his position. So I think, at the beginning, the ceasefire was the easiest part to get, because I think the Israelis were like, okay, the Israelis, it was very clear to me that, they were, part of this operation in Gaza also is work to undermine the Democratic administration and weaken the Democratic Party. I don't think that was, that might have not been the main objective of Netanyahu, but I think it was a kind of part of Netanyahu's policy was to fracture the Democratic Party. Netanyahu has intervened in the United States politics quite directly since the Obama era. So I think the ceasefire was a gift. It's like, okay, we'll do the ceasefire, make Trump look good and things like that. But now we've got to this kind of crunchy issue where it's like, okay, we've got the ceasefire. How do we get to a permanent peace? And now we're seeing, whereas right at the beginning, the America First people, the pro-Israel lobby, and the Israelis themselves were all on the kind of same page with this ceasefire to give Trump his win on paper. I think now we're seeing the differences, because I think the America First people was like, okay, let's move to this kind of, let's get this settled down, and so we can like not have to deal with it. And then, of course, I think the pro-Israel faction is winning out, because it is absurd to watch American commentators, American diplomats start talking about how Hamas has broken the ceasefire. Anyone who follows anything that I've said, I'm no fan of Hamas or Islamism in general, but it's just an objective fact that the Israelis have kind of broken the ceasefire and kind of tried to change the terms. You can't spin it any other way. But they have to live in this kind of delusional world, which even the Israeli press is talking about in a very overt way. This was linked to the need to pass a budget in Israel. You have the necessity of bringing in right-wing coalition people who are never happy with that ceasefire to pass the budget. Netanyahu's corruption campaigns going on.
Huge war budget now, but like largest defense budget ever passed.
Exactly. And also this is a lifeline for Netanyahu. So long as you sustain the war, it becomes politically impossible to remove him from office. It becomes extremely difficult to remove him from office. So I think the America First people, and I think they're losing this conflict, and they're going to lose this conflict for now. But I think they're not happy about it. I think they're like, okay, it doesn't make sense to them that you're against the supporting Ukraine, but suddenly it's okay to support Israel. Either you support both or you're against both. But there's a kind of contradiction between being so vehemently against supporting Ukraine and so vehemently against withdrawing or at least leveraging support against Israel. And I think, there's always the kind of like the bubbling anti-Semitism, about it's like, oh, the Jews control the world. There's always that. But I think it would be a mistake to reduce everything to that. I think there's an element of the America First people who are just like, this just doesn't make sense.
It's a good observation, actually, because I mean, as this plays out in particularly in domestic politics and in the terms of the culture war, I think something's changed, particularly with Israel, Palestine, and to a certain extent with the Ukraine war as well, in that both of these cut through lines that previously the line that previously existed, which divided cultural liberals from conservatives, right? Which was basically the terms on which the culture war was fought, or those were the two sides in the culture war. And both Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine kind of split those both sides, right? It exposes kind of divisions within the right and divisions within the left liberals. And so it kind of re-scrambles and reorders a little bit the terms that we've known politics, or the lines on which politics has been fought, which is the kind of culture war lines of liberals versus conservatives.
I totally agree, because I think, being pro-Palestine and being pro-Ukraine is actually the logical position to take for if national self-determination is your kind of be-all and end-all of politics.
Yeah.
How can you be, I always found on the left the pro-Russia, pro-Palestinian argument to be just so contradictory with one another. And I think we're seeing these contradictions coming up because we have kind of a conflict between principles and, like you said, how certain issues are coded in the culture war, whether they're a left coded issue or a right coded issue. And it really speaks to the superficiality of a lot of political discourse, because nobody really discusses the underlying principle. If you support national self-determination, then clearly it's the most logical position is to support Palestine and Ukraine, because it's their right of national self-determination, which is under threat in different ways, but it makes sense. Or if you're, the other way, support Russia, support Israel. But this kind of the way that these issues have been like sorted through the culture war, through this left coding and right coding, leads to a completely contradictory and very confusing thing that I think a lot of people feel really confused, because like one minute people are yelling in favor of, saying that Ukraine are all Nazis, right? And then they're like also saying like, Hamas are like going to usher in socialism. Like it makes no sense.
Yeah. No, exactly. So, speaking about, well, it's maybe the fusion of Eastern Europe, or certainly the Balkans and the Middle East. It's Turkey. I'm going to try to avoid all these kind of East meets West cliches, but actually, we're going to talk about Turkey primarily because starting as of the 19th of March, which is a week ago from when we're recording this, the following the detention and the arrest of the Istanbul mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, correct my pronunciation or don't, and as well as hundreds of other opposition members and protesters by Turkish authorities, there have been large protests across Turkish cities. And not for the first time, Erdogan is being challenged on the streets. So we want to talk about this just as a way to set this up. George and I were talking in terms of planning this episode a little while ago, a few days ago. I don't want to pretend that we have so much foresight. It was a few days ago, and that we realized like we maybe haven't talked as much about Turkey on this podcast as we should have done. I mean, we've done two dedicated episodes on Turkey, and it's come up in various other contexts, whether episodes about Syria or kind of global overviews and things like that. But Turkey, in many ways, exemplifies the end of history. I think it's one of the key countries, I think, of the past sort of 10, 20 years. And it's not just because of kind of East meets West cliches, but it's a semi-peripheral emerging economy which has seen quite fast growth. It's an exemplar of a form of national populism, I guess, if you could call Erdogan's regime that. It's also has elements of kind of constitutional dictatorship, which is rather in vogue at the moment. You don't put the tanks in the streets, you just kind of steadily gnaw away at constitutional rights and kind of chip away at the borders of democracy, independent judiciary, and so on. Turkey's kind of experience over the past decades, particularly under Erdogan, breaks with the kind of idea of everyone eventually becomes a Western liberal democracy. So it runs right against the sort of Fukuyaman narrative of the end of history, and particularly as the Erdogan regime has been framed and set up in opposition to the secularism which has dominated Turkey for a century. So that also seems to run against a lot of modernization narratives. There's the kind of political divide in Turkey, as far as I understand it, is one in which you have a kind of cultural divide, which is somewhat transversal to class. So you have urban or metropolitan social liberals who are mainly secular, and you've got rural or provincial social conservatives. And this is in some ways a left versus right thing. In other ways, it isn't. It's also it's fought out kind of in class terms, but not as traditionally understood either. So there's a lot of kind of recombination of class and culture in a way which is very much of our times, even indeed in the way that we've already been referring to with regard to the US. It's also kind of a neoliberal success story, but not with so much austerity, a lot of building out, but also post-neoliberal features. So, Erdogan famously has been facing down kind of central bankers and going, well, we can just ignore inflation. We'll just keep the interest rates low. That's now changed to a certain extent, but
you got to watch out for the interest lobbies. That's what Erdogan talks about, that the interest lobby, those people who are trying to impose higher interest rates on him.
Right.
I think may refer to a certain ethno-religious group, but indirectly.
Money people, money lenders. I got to watch out for them. And then, of course, you have the kind of what's been called a sort of neo-Ottoman foreign policy. I don't know if Djene agrees with that kind of conceptualization of it. So we're going to talk about this in just a second. I just wanted to kind of fill you in case you haven't been on the Bunga train for the past month. Just a recap: we had two big philosophy and theory episodes. Todd McGowan talked to us about why we should worry a little bit less about alienation. How about a certain amount of it is actually kind of productive and necessary? And Jensen Souther was on talking about the return to Hegel and how we should meet people where they are. Specifically, if people treasure the autonomy and freedom that capitalism promises, and to a certain extent, a very limited one-sided sense provides, how can we seek to realize that more fully? And why to realize that requires social transformation? We also asked kind of a rare opportunity to do this. The same question to different guests, which we did over, the space of a couple of weeks, which is, what is the meaning and purpose of critical theory after the defeat of the working class? And I think they gave contrasting answers. So I would recommend you to check out both episodes for yourself and let us know what you think, in fact, on that question, because I think it's quite central to our concerns. We also talked to Ben Bradlow about urban power in global South countries like Brazil and South Africa. Countries that are sort of united by a shared passage from authoritarian developmentalism in the 60s, 70s, 80s, through to democracy and neoliberalism, and the disappointments that followed that. And then we had Dan Evans and his lush Welsh accent back on the pod, telling us about the two wings of the small bourgeoisie. You got the downwardly mobile, white collar college graduates, and the quite heterogeneous group of the self-employed, be it manual workers or people in intellectual services, and small business owners. Both of these, Dan argues in that episode. And I think it's an excellent episode. I can say that because I wasn't involved in it. Really good. I kind of re-listened to it this morning while out for a walk, and I thought, yeah, that's really good stuff.
It's just a coincidence that you weren't involved in
No,
it was such a good episode.
Let listeners be the judge of that. But anyway, both of these wings of the kind of petty bourgeoisie, or the new petty bourgeoisie, as Dan calls them, were the prime movers of populisms left and right, and that people rather overstate the working class's role in both of these moments. And just to trail a couple of things coming up, more on Magaland, Lee Jones, Alex Gurovich, and myself will be welcoming Corey Robin back on the podcast to talk about why Trump's slew of executive orders and much else demonstrates the sort of abortive and weak nature of his rule, which runs contrary to a lot of liberal narrative about dictatorship. And then we'll have the delayed reading club episode. Sorry about that, but we had some scheduling issues. It's an episode which is due out in March. It'll be out soon, early in the next month. The first one will be on Perry Anderson's work on internationalism, and then Eric Hobsbawm on the invention of tradition. So kind of have a double. I was going to say double bender. That's not the right word, but whatever. If you want to have a double bender,
An omnibus.
go wild, an omnibus. Yeah, which
Double
I never
fe-
understood that word when it was used
double
with regard
feature?
to double feature. Yeah,
An
Double A
ender.
side.
Yeah,
Double A side.
yeah, good. All these.
Omnibus has
They're
two
both-
floors, doesn't it? So that's why it's got two.
It's a double decker. Okay, so join us for this double decker next month, which will kick off the second section of this year's reading club, which is on nationalism and internationalism in the 21st century. And then also an episode which, again, I wasn't involved in, so George can trail it for you. George re-encountered Paradise Lost.
Paradise Regained, almost.
Mm.
No, this was I'm really want to hear what listeners have to say on this really wide-ranging episode that we did with Alex Gorovich and I did with Orlando Reed on his book on the great epic poem Paradise Lost by John Milton, where we talked a little bit about the poem, a little bit about ideas of freedom in this poem, in that historical period. You know, is it Satan rebelling against God? Is that the freedom? Is it Eve eating the apple? Sorry if you didn't, if that's a spoiler for people. Is that the expression of freedom, or is it something about following rules that can actually be freedom, and that Eve's disobedience was actually a big problem? But anyway, really, I think a great episode. So I'm really keen to hear what listeners make of that.
Excellent. You're not allowed to say it's an excellent episode. You were involved in
No,
it.
I am. I normally don't do that, but this time I just, because it's not come out yet, I feel like I can say this.
Excellent. Well, I haven't heard it yet either, so I'm looking forward to it. Right, Turkey. Djene, why are these protests happening? And also, can you put them in the context of previous revolts against Erdogan?
So let's begin with what these protests that are taking place are like about, kind of from the top down. There is a mayor of Istanbul, as you mentioned at the top there, Ekrem İmamoğlu. You pronounced it very well, if you ask me. And he was elected in 2019. Istanbul has long been Istanbul is a huge city, as I'm sure everybody knows. It's 16 million people. The mayor of Istanbul is a very important position, more important than any other mayor, because, you know, on the most basic level, next to the president of Turkey, who's directly elected, the mayor of Istanbul has the largest democratic mandate in Turkey. And of course, as you might expect in a country like Turkey, being able to distribute largesse through the local government system is an extremely important mechanism of political control and political power. Erdogan, famously came up in the Istanbul political system. This is, controlling Istanbul has been a really important aspect of the AKP's march to power and things like that. So in 2019, the loss of the Istanbul municipality election to the opposition, Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, which is we can call it the party of Ataturk. It's got the same name as the party of Ataturk, but it's not actually the same party, because the original Republican People's Party was shut down and kind of reestablished later. So it's like a tribute band, CHP, but it's the Kemalist party. they won control of Istanbul with this charismatic, relatively young, at the time of his election, he was in his mid-40s, leader, and it was a very controversial election. It was very close. The AKP pulled out all the stops to defeat him. For example, the pro-Kurdish political party had a kind of tacit electoral alliance to support İmamoğlu, and the Turkish government allowed the publication of a letter from Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which called on Kurds to remain neutral in this election. So they pulled out all the stops. İmamoğlu won the election. The AKP made them rerun the election, and he won by a bigger margin. There was another election, he won that again. And, after the disastrous failure of the presidential election with the last election where the opposition lost, it looked like İmamoğlu was actually he was on the verge of being selected as the presidential candidate. He's relatively charismatic. He is one of the few political leaders who kind of has confidence of a variety of different sections of this opposition. And then all of a sudden, we see the AKP as we're heading towards these presidential primaries, where İmamoğlu is going to be selected as the presidential candidate, the guy to run against Erdogan, with the polls looking like İmamoğlu is going to win or drive Erdogan for power in 2028. Suddenly, Istanbul University announces that actually, they're going to revoke his degree, right? And why does that matter? It's because under Turkish law, you have to have a university diploma in order to run for the presidency. It's somewhat ironic because there's a lot of questions about the validity of Erdogan's university degree. So suddenly they do this kind of thing where they just take away his degree. Then they come and arrest him, and not just him, but also all a lot of his aides and political allies from around the Istanbul Council. Again, we say Istanbul municipal government, but it's a municipal government for a city that's bigger than Austria, Switzerland combined, right? It's this huge thing. So they arrest him on charges of corruption. So there's these claims that there's corruption taking place, and well, it's Turkey, so I'm sure there is some corruption that you can find. But there's really nothing has been demonstrated very clearly. It's all innuendo and hearsay. And then also the weirdest part is they also arrested him for having negotiations with the PKK, apparently working with the PKK, which is somewhat ironic considering only a few weeks ago we were talking about the Turkish government entering into some kind of peace process with the PKK. So they've got him on this on corruption and terrorism, taken away his diploma. They're covering all the stops to force him out of
it sounds like corruption and terrorism would be the pro forma pretext charges, made up charges that you would just throw in most countries in the world.
Yeah,
really,
the classics.
Yeah,
It's corruption and terrorism, and this is not uncommon. This kind of combination has been used for years in Turkey to remove Kurdish mayors. So the pro-Kurdish party, the HDP, which is now called Dem Party, they changed their names to avoid being shut down. It's whenever I try to explain legal Kurdish political parties in Turkey, is extremely difficult because it's like an alphabet soup, because it's this constant cat of mouse game since the early 90s of there's a Kurdish party, they shut it down, they reopen it under a new name, they shut that one down. So anyway, we'll just say the Kurdish party to keep it simple. The Kurdish party had its MPs arrested, had its mayors removed from office. They appoint these individuals called kayyum, trustees, centrally appointed figures in the Turkish. In the Turkish local municipal government system, you kind of have two parallels. You have the belediye, which is the elected council, but then you have the vali, who's the governor. So you have a centrally appointed kind of prefect, as it were. And basically they've kind of they were doing this for years, but doing it to Kurds in the southeast of the country is one thing. Doing it to Istanbul, the biggest municipality in the country, that's a qualitative escalation against it. One thing to do it to Kurdish political parties, but to do it to the main Kemalist opposition party is a big issue. So they arrest him. And then he releases on, I think, on like a TikTok or something. He's like, I'm surrendering myself to a police. He does a tacit call for protests. The government tries to shut down Taksim Square, which is the place where previous protests have taken place. Like labor protests in the 70s, the famous Gezi Park incident in the early 2010s. They shut that down, but instead they start protesting outside of the municipal government. And so you have these big protests taking place. Students at the vanguard. You have CHP, Republican People parties, individual, like addressing the crowds.
So talk us through, because it's been, I think, I don't know if they're protesting tonight, but I think they've been protesting certainly the past 6 days. So can you talk us through kind of who the people are on the streets? Because I'm sure that they can't be purely reduced to CHP supporters necessarily, though maybe they can. Maybe you can tell me, and also maybe also explain kind of what the official opposition actually consists of.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. Obviously, first of all, it's very hard to ascertain things when you're outside of the country because there's a media lockdown taking place. One of the probably the best Substack on Turkey, if people want to listen to it, is Selim Koru's Culture Camp, which is a good one, which he talks about. He was talking about how it was being covered on the Turkish news, where basically they're just saying stuff like, we want a good opposition party, but the CHP is so corrupt. We have to do something. It's so sad that it's like this, not really covering this and things like that. So a lot of things are coming out through, international press, through just people. A lot of websites. Elon Musk, famous free speech warrior, has cooperated with the Turkish government to shut down certain opposition accounts. So it's very hard to get information out. But from people I've spoken to in Turkey at the moment, obviously you have CHP supporters, you have youth. And this is extremely important because the generation that's coming up now in Turkey, they've been born and raised under Erdogan. There's no one that, if you were a millennial like me in 2010 or something like that, you could still blame a lot of the problems in Turkey on, like previous administrations, how it was in the past. You're still kind of dealing with that. But, now it's just, we've had since 2002 Erdogan, like there's a whole generation of people coming into adulthood in, if you consider anyone in Gen Z who is born really only remembers AKP rule. And with the current economic situation in Turkey, things are not great for the youth. Neoliberalism gets a bad rap in the West, but if you're in the developing world, neoliberalism was pretty good for a while, right? Because it meant a lot of business coming to your country. I mean, when I lived in Turkey in the 2010s, you could it changed within, I've never seen a place. No, that's not true. Erbil in Iraq was the place which changed so dramatically in 20 years. But Turkey changed very, very quickly. You had the emergence.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if we're talking about kind of generations and memory, that certainly is the case if you don't remember the 80s debt crises. And, so if your picture of neoliberalism is one, I mean, it's certainly in countries like Turkey of the period from the 2000s onwards, yeah, it might be a kind of, it might be a good thing. Yeah. I mean, you might oppose certain, the closures of public space or whatever, like the kind of Gezi was an issue around Gezi Park. But yeah, there's certainly the kind of the sunny side of neoliberalism, which people got.
And another important point, which a scholar called Cihan Turgul has made, is that in Turkey, when we think about neoliberalism, we think about the dismantling of universalist public programs, right? But it doesn't mean the end of the social safety net neoliberalism. More this idea of a targeted social safety net, like Clinton did and things like that. They don't get rid of it, but they say, this is just for really, really poor people. Well, imagine how that's going to be used in Turkey. You have this kind of strategic use of social welfare to bolster elements of society that have, are suffering. So they used to distribute free coal to people and things like that. So they were also able to use welfare, this kind of targeted welfare to create clientless networks within Turkey. So, the early phases of the AKP period had this kind of economic growth, optimism about the future. But now we've hit this period where there's like hyperinflation. Erdogan doesn't want to, and to be fair to Erdogan, they're between a rock and a hard place, right? Because when you raise interest rates, what you're talking about is throwing people out of work, throwing millions of people out of work. So you've got a choice between hyperinflation or mass unemployment in Turkey. So Erdogan is like, well, for various ideological reasons as well, I think interesting. There's this kind of, he comes out of an Islamist political tradition. I wouldn't say he's like a doctrinaire Islamist, but there's certain impulses that gives you, the ideas like interest, lobby, that kind of stuff. So you have a place where there's like a crisis for the middle class. You have growing inequality. You have hyperinflation wiping out people's debts. You have kids looking back today saying like, where are the opportunities? People want to leave the country and things like that. So you have this very tense political, or at least a significant section of society that is feeling a kind of, of the youth that's, ready to go to the streets because of the lack of opportunities that are existing in the country. But beyond that, you have, the more liberal elements of Turkish society. You have nationalist elements of Turkish society, but anti-Erdogan nationalist elements of Turkish society. It's very interesting to see some of the slogans. For example, you'll see left-wing slogans alongside anti-Kurdish slogans in the same protest. So there's still a kind of heterogeneous, I was looking before I came on, I wanted to, so I could speak a little bit more intelligently on here. I, had a look at just went through the photos of these protests to see what kind of, what party flags are being shown, what kind of things. So it's very heterogeneous in certain states. There is an anti-Erdogan sentiment amongst a significant portion of the population, but the people, some people are leftists, some people are liberals, some people are kind of social democratic CHP people, some people are Turkish nationalist Kemalist. So you have like very nationalistic slogans being yelled in these protests. You have conflicts, and these conflicts go right up to the political leadership of the CHP. The chairman of the CHP issued kind of like an apology to Kurds because the mayor of Istanbul, the mayor of Ankara, who's also CHP but also associated with Turkish nationalism, basically made an anti-Kurdish statement, stated that the AKP was using police to give candy floss to Kurdish children, to PKK supporters, but attacking Turks. With some of these people just. Even with the gun against their head, they can't get the anti-Kurdishness out of themselves. It's like a real big problem for him.
I mean, I think I might have said this before on this podcast. I don't know, but I remember being in Istanbul and being kind of very liberal areas and people drinking and drinking alcohol and whatever. And talk to someone and they whatever, been to university, and they're kind of very whatever, you kind of a standard liberal. But then they're like, but we should also kill all the Kurds, or like something. And you're like, whoa, like kind of the expression of views which you wouldn't find amongst their equivalents in Western Europe, for example.
Oh, it's bonkers. It's bonkers.
Yeah, but I had a more serious point, which was that I think that it does seem like a pattern when you have a leader like Erdogan, who, as you said before, could kind of in different moments occupy all four quadrants of the political compass. Even if we could say, he's ultimately a kind of conservative figure, nevertheless has these moments where he's able to have more kind of left-wing elements, more liberal elements, more conservative elements, and so on. And where he's been the only government that many people have known for a generation, that the opposition to it and emerges as something very heterogeneous as well, right? It kind of almost reflects the kind of transversal nature of a person like Erdogan as well.
I mean, you can actually compare this to the last truly powerful Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II in the late 19th century. Like when we think about the Turkish state, the institutional foundations of the Turkish state are created in the 19th century through the Ottoman reform process. And this model of a constitutional autocracy we see in Abdulhamid II, which is an individual that, Erdogan is not exactly emulating, but he's one of the good guys in the historical narrative of Turkey. And Abdulhamid, reigned for 30 years between 1876 and 1909. And what was interesting about the Hamidian period is that it is truly a constitutional autocracy. And what I mean by that is, in the early 19th century, Sultan Mahmud II, who was like the, kind of like the first really successful reformist Ottoman Sultan, still was operating in this kind of patrimonial pre-modern system. When he didn't like a Grand Vizier, the Grand Vizier would find himself accidentally strangled to death and dumped in the Bosphorus. That's how you do it back in those days. Abdulhamid II, when he came to power, what did he do to the liberal Grand Vizier? Put him on trial, right? And then the Grand Vizier goes to jail in Yemen and Epstein's himself, right? but that's telling about how power is exercised. Like you don't just strangle someone to death. And Erdogan is doing this kind of constitutional autocracy. And the other thing that comes out of the Hamidian era is the Young Turks, which is an extremely heterogeneous political movement, a movement that contains within it the people who executed the Armenian genocide, but also liberals who wanted to move to a kind of multicultural Ottoman Empire. So we see a kind of, I don't want to say history repeats itself, but we see a similar pattern emerging. We have this kind of constitutional autocracy that is established in the early 21st century. And I fell for this too. For the first couple of years, it looked like we're moving in a liberal direction. But, in retrospect, that period was really a liberal atmosphere created out of the conflict taking place within the quote unquote deep state between the Kemalist old guard and the Erdoganists. That created a space for like discussion and relative freedom. But once that conflict was over, once the old Kemalist vanguard was either aged out, retired, or purged, especially after the thing, then we kind of return we go to in this more autocratic direction. So that means there's a lot of opposition forces, maybe half the country, maybe a little bit more than half the country, but completely ideologically fragmented between ultra nationalists, socialist and communist, like millennial left types of people, old school Kemalists, ultra nationalists who will criticize the AKP from the right, some Islamists who feel like they've lost their. So you have this very heterogeneous opposition movement that really needs a charismatic figure to unite it to take power. And it looked like İmamoğlu was actually a serious contender to be that charisma. There isn't anyone else in the CHP really who can carry a coalition that brings all those groups together. So Erdogan lawfare his opposition. This is another thing about Erdogan is back when you go to the 80s and 90s and you look at how the state operated dealing with dissidents, it was like you get put in the back of a white Renault and disappeared in the mountains.
Yeah.
Shot on the streets and things like that. Erdogan doesn't do that, right? Erdogan lawfares people. So the Turkish state is both in certain ways less violent in that they're not doing these kind of extrajudicial kill. They still do them a bit, but they just lawfare people, right? They just they get people in jail for their social media posts. Like a good example is in the 90s when they used to suppress the Kurdish parties, they used to just like shoot people on the street, would put people on trial. But there was Ape Musa, a very famous Kurdish intellectual, gunned down, head of the Diyarbakir Bar Association, gunned down. Right now they don't do that. Right, they just put some charges on people, and by doing that, they can actually purge political parties to a far greater degree. You have thousands of people being rounded up. They're not just rounding up leaders, mid-level people, just anyone who's made a social media post. So you have this kind of very effective autocratic regime that
is what's happened now with İmamoğlu. Is that like similar, though perhaps smaller in scale? Than the repression that followed the failed coup of 2016.
I mean,
is it kind of like, is it comparable to that?
I mean, the repression that followed the failed coup was really like the kind of golden opportunity where you have this huge purge of state institutions. So that's largely done now, right? So I would say I would say it's part of this ongoing post 2015. The coup in 2015. Erdogan lost his first election, right? Didn't lose completely. AKP remained the largest party, but they lost their parliamentary monopoly, their majority. And they lost it in two directions, partly from people going to the right, people voting for the MHP, the Nationalist Action Party, the kind of grey wolf fascist group, and partly because the Kurdish political party was also growing at that time. And so, after that election, you see Erdogan moving in a much more authoritarian way. You see many, for example, parliamentary, and I remember at the time thinking like, they're going to use this against Kurds now, but they're going to use this against the CHP in 5 years. And they did. They removed parliamentary immunity from people. They made it possible to like get people out of parliament and prosecute them. And then, of course, so this is taking place. The coup in 2016 kind of just accelerates this process and leads to a bigger purge, especially of these quote-unquote Gülenist elements within the state, which had been an ally of Erdogan. Long story, which we don't need to go in. But
Yeah.
we have the mechanisms of this lawfare regime being created in 2015, 2016. And then since 2016, you've had similar things happen, right? You've had mayors removed, replaced by government officials, mayors put in jail, but mainly in Kurdish regions of the country. So this is, I have a phrase, I say, in Turkish, it's, İstibat giden yolu Kürdistan'dan geçer. It's the road to tyranny goes through Kurdistan, right? So like, and this is very true in, across the Middle East. Turkey's one-party state was consolidated in the aftermath of a major Kurdish uprising in 1925. And we're seeing here, you have this kind of lawfare across the Kurdish areas of the country, and then that lawfare coming home, the famous thing, and colonialism comes home or imperialism. So this, I would say, is a continuity of the post-2015 political order that emerges in Turkey, the kind of end of the liberal phase of Erdogan and the move towards the kind of more nationalist or populist phase of Erdogan. And now that kind of rot has like hit Istanbul.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/Bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the Bungacast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the Bungacast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/Bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.